What if I told you there's a place in America, a quiet, unassuming patch of forest in Vermont where the woods themselves seem to have an appetite? A place where in the span of just 5 years, 5 people walked in and simply ceased to exist. No bodies, no ransom notes, no logical explanation, just gone. As if the land itself had swallowed them whole. We're not talking about ancient history. We're talking about the dawn of the atomic age, post-World War II America. This isn't folklore. This is fact. Hey everyone, what's up? Welcome back. Tonight we're taking a long, slow drive up to New England, deep into the Green Mountains. We're not here for the fall foliage or the maple syrup, though. We're here to talk about the Bennington Triangle. Now, you might have heard the name whispered in some Reddit thread or a late-night paranormal show, but we're not just gonna skim the surface. Oh no. We're going deep. We're getting into the nitty-gritty, the unvarnished truth. We'll talk about the botched searches, the weird evidence that was ignored, and the strange history of the land itself that most accounts just gloss over. This is the stuff they definitely didn't teach you in your high school history class. You see, when most people tell this story, they focus on the disappearances themselves, the who, when, and where. But they miss the why. They miss the context. They miss the fact that this isn't just a collection of random tragedies. This is a story about a place that has been swallowing people whole for generations. A place that was considered cursed long before the first European settler ever set foot on American soil. We're going to meet 5 people tonight, 5 very different people from very different walks of life. A grizzled old mountain guide who knew these woods like the back of his weathered hand. A bright college sophomore with her whole life ahead of her. A war veteran just trying to get home. A little boy in a red jacket. And a woman whose story breaks every rule of what should be possible in our rational, ordered world. But before we meet them, we need to understand the stage where their final acts played out. Because this isn't just about people vanishing. This is about a mountain that has been hungry for a very, very long time. So as always, this is a long-form deep dive. It's designed for you to put on, get comfortable, and let the story wash over you. So dim those lights, get your headphones on, maybe grab a drink. We're going to be here for a while. No jump scares, I promise. The horror here is quiet, existential, and frankly a lot more unsettling. This is the kind of story that creeps up on you. It starts with what seems like a simple question. How do people just disappear? But by the end you'll realize we've been asking the wrong question entirely. The real question isn't how they disappeared. The real question is why that particular place at that particular time seemed to develop such a taste for human souls. We're talking about real people here, real families who lost loved ones, real searchers who combed through miles of wilderness, looking for any trace, any clue, any hope. Real investigators who had to write reports that essentially said, we have no idea what happened here, but it defies everything we know about how the world works. And hey, while you're getting settled, if you dig this kind of weird historical content, the kind that makes you look at a map a little differently, do me a solid and hit that like button. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing. It's free and it tells the algorithm that there are people out there who want more than just 10-minute hot takes. Only if you're into the real story, of course. Because here's the thing about stories like this, they don't fit neatly into the modern world's need for quick answers and easy explanations. They require patience. They require you to sit with uncertainty. They require you to accept that sometimes the world is stranger and more mysterious than our rational minds want to admit. This isn't clickbait. This isn't manufactured drama. This is just what happened in all its inexplicable, unsettling glory. 5 people walked into the Vermont wilderness, and only one of them ever came back out. And even she came back wrong in a way that raises more questions than it answers. All right, everyone, comfy. Good. To understand why 5 people might vanish from a forest, we first have to understand the forest itself. Before we meet the victims, we need to meet the main character of this story, Glastonbury Mountain. A place with a history long before any of them were even born, a history written in blood, bankruptcy, and shadows. You see, the Bennington Triangle didn't just suddenly appear in the 1940s. It's been there all along, waiting. The Native Americans knew it. The early settlers learned it the hard way. And by the time our 5 victims arrived, the mountain had already been practicing its craft for centuries. So let's start at the beginning, when the world was younger and the line between the natural and supernatural was a lot thinner than it is today. Let's talk about a mountain that was already legendary for all the wrong reasons, long before it became synonymous with the impossible. Imagine a landscape carved by glaciers ancient and unforgiving. Picture mountains that have stood sentinel over New England for millions of years, watching civilizations rise and fall like seasons. The Green Mountains of Vermont stretch across the landscape like the spine of some sleeping giant, and right in the heart of them sits Glastonbury Mountain. It's beautiful, sure, but in a don't you dare get lost kind of way. These aren't the friendly rolling hills you see in postcards. These are mountains with teeth, dense forests that seem to close in behind you as you walk. Valleys that swallow sound and spit back echoes that don't quite match what you said. Weather that can shift from pleasant autumn day to life-threatening blizzard in the time it takes to realize you should have turned back an hour ago. The elevation here isn't extreme by mountain standards. We're talking about peaks around 3,000 feet, but elevation isn't everything. What matters is the terrain. What matters is how easy it is to lose your bearings when every tree looks the same, and every trail seems to fork into 3 more trails that weren't there yesterday. What matters is how quickly help can reach you when things go wrong. And up here, things go wrong fast. The geological story of this place reads like a textbook on how to create the perfect natural trap. You've got granite bedrock shot through with quartz veins, creating a landscape riddled with caves, crevices, and hidden drops that can open up under your feet without warning. You've got old mining shafts from the 19th century, most of them forgotten. None of them mark some of them deep enough to swallow a person whole. The weather patterns here are notoriously unpredictable. You've got valleys that create their own microclimates, places where fog can roll in thick as cotton and stay for days. You've got sudden temperature drops that can catch you wearing shorts and a t-shirt and leave you hypothermic before you realize what's happening. It's the kind of place where experienced hikers pack winter gear in July just in case. But the real character of this place, the thing that sets it apart from every other patch of wilderness in New England, isn't written in the geology textbooks. It's written in the stories passed down by the people who lived here first, long before the first European settlers arrived with their axes and their absolute certainty that they could tame any wilderness. The Abenaki people knew this mountain. They had a name for it that roughly translates to the Lonely One, and they had stories about why it earned that name. To them, Glastonbury Mountain wasn't just another geographic feature. It was a place where the 4 winds met a cosmic intersection, where the natural order of things got a little loose. They spoke of it as a place of chaotic, unpredictable energy, basically the universe's most beautiful and terrifying intersection. The Abenaki were not people who scared easily. These were folks who had survived ice ages, who had built thriving communities in one of the harshest climates on the continent. They knew every plant, every animal, every season of every valley in their territory. But Glastonbury Mountain, that was different. That was a place you went around, not through. Their stories spoke of the mountain as a dwelling place for spirits, but not the helpful kind. These were hungry spirits, restless spirits, spirits that had never quite figured out how to let go of the physical world. The mountain was a thin place, they said, where the boundary between our world and the spirit world was stretched gossamer thin. They told stories of hunters who went up the mountain and came back changed if they came back at all. Stories of strange lights that danced between the trees at night. Stories of sounds that had no earthly source, voices that called your name in languages you didn't recognize but somehow understood. The Abenaki practice of avoiding the mountain wasn't superstition. It was practical wisdom earned through generations of experience. They had learned, probably the hard way, that some places are just fundamentally hostile to human presence. Some places have their own agenda. When the first European settlers arrived, and the Abenaki tried to warn them about the mountain, you can probably guess how well that went over. Colonial Americans weren't exactly known for their receptiveness to native wisdom. They had God on their side after all, and axes, and an unshakable belief that any wilderness could be conquered with enough determination and gunpowder. They would learn differently, but by then, it would be too late for a lot of people. Think of it like a 19th century crypto boom. Everyone rushed in thinking they'd get rich cutting down trees and digging coal out of the ground. They built a town, a railroad, the whole 9 yards. They named it Glastonbury after the legendary English town associated with King Arthur and mystical happenings. Perhaps not the most auspicious choice of names in retrospect. The problem, the business model was terrible, the winters were brutal, and the place was just mean. Glastonbury, Vermont was founded in the 1760s, but it didn't really hit its stride until the mid-1800s, when the Industrial Revolution created a massive demand for charcoal and lumber. Suddenly, those vast forests that had seemed so forbidding to earlier generations looked like dollar signs. The mountain was covered in old-growth timber, and underneath that timber were coal deposits that could fuel the growing industrial machine of New England. So they came, loggers and miners and their families drawn by the promise of steady work and good wages in a state where both were often hard to come by. At its peak, Glastonbury was home to over 200 people. They had a post office, a railroad depot company, stores, boarding houses. For a brief moment in the 1880s, it looked like they had actually managed to tame the mountain. But if you're paying attention to the theme of this story, you know that mountains like Glastonbury don't get tamed. They just bide their time. The first sign of trouble was the work itself. Logging accidents in Glastonbury were more frequent and more severe than in other timber operations across Vermont. Trees fell the wrong way, crushing experienced lumberjacks who should have known better. Saws kicked back without warning. Men disappeared for days at a time, only to be found miles from where they should have been with no memory of how they got there. The mining was worse. Cave-ins were common. Equipment failed in ways that defied explanation. The coal itself was of poor quality, full of impurities that made it almost worthless. Men would go down into the mines healthy and come up sick with ailments that local doctors had never seen before. Then there were the accidents that weren't quite accidents. The strange deaths that had no clear cause. Workers who simply vanished during their shifts, leaving behind tools still warm from their hands. Others who were found dead with no marks on them, no sign of violence or disease, as if life had simply decided to leave their bodies. The winters were particularly brutal. Glastonbury sits in a valley that seems designed to trap cold air and hold it there like a grudge. Temperatures would drop to levels that made outdoor work impossible for months at a time. Supplies would run low. The railroad would be snowed in for weeks. Cabin fever would set in, and with it came violence. There were murders, suicides, mysterious disappearances that made people whisper about the old Abenaki warnings. Families would pack up and leave in the middle of the night, abandoning everything they couldn't carry. The population began to dwindle. By the 1890s, the writing was on the wall. The good timber was gone. The coal deposits had proven more myth than reality. The railroad was losing money on every run up the mountain. One by one, the businesses closed. The families moved away. The town began its slow slide toward abandonment. The final blow came in 1898 when the last logging operation pulled out. Within 2 years, Glastonbury was officially disincorporated. The state of Vermont basically said, you know what, forget this place exists. The post office closed, the railroad tracks were torn up and sold for scrap. The buildings were left to rot. By 1900, Glastonbury Mountain was once again what it had always been, a vast empty wilderness, where the wind whistled through the ruins of human ambition, and the trees slowly reclaimed what had never really belonged to civilization in the first place. But here's the thing about abandoned places, especially places that were abandoned for good reason. They don't stay empty. Oh, the people leave. The sounds of industry die away. The smoke stops rising from the chimneys, but something else moves in. Something that was there before the people arrived, and will be there long after the last foundation stone crumbles to dust. The locals who lived in the valleys around Glastonbury Mountain had a name for what the ruins had become. They called it the Haunted Village. Children were forbidden to play there. Hunters avoided it even when game was scarce. The occasional hiker who stumbled across the remains would report feeling watched, followed as if the empty building still had occupants who didn't appreciate visitors. There were stories, of course, strange lights seen moving through the ruins at night, sounds of machinery running when there was no machinery left to run. voices calling out in the darkness, speaking words in a language that might have been English, but was somehow wrong, somehow twisted. And then there were the disappearances, even before our famous 5 people had been vanishing on Glastonbury Mountain. Hunters who went out and never came back. Hikers whose families found their camps intact, but empty as if they had simply evaporated while making breakfast. Children who wandered too far from home and were never seen again. The mountain had developed a reputation, a hunger. Local families would tell their children stories about Glastonbury not to entertain them, but to keep them away. The mountain became a local boogeyman, a place that parents used to scare their children into staying close to home. By the time our story really begins in the mid-1940s, Glastonbury Mountain had been feeding on human disappearances for decades. It had practice, it had developed an appetite, and it was about to get very, very hungry. The ruins of the old town were still there, half hidden by 40 years of forest growth, the foundation stones poking through the leaf litter like bones. The old mining shafts, unmarked and unguarded, waiting like open mouths in the earth. The trails that led to nowhere, or worse, to places that weren't on any map. It was the perfect setting for a horror story. The only problem was, nobody knew they were living in one until it was too late. The mountain had been patient. It had waited through the bustle of the timber boom and the chaos of the town's collapse. It had waited through the slow decades of abandonment while the forest crept back over the scars left by human ambition. It had been feeding quietly and intermittently on the occasional lost soul who wandered too far from the safety of civilization. But the 1940s would be different. The 1940s would be its time to feast. 5 people in 5 years taken in ways that defied logic and left investigators scratching their heads and filing reports that read like bad science fiction. The mountain had been practicing for this moment for a very long time, and it was ready to show the world just how good it had gotten at making people disappear. Let's get one thing straight right from the start. This wasn't some city slicker who got lost because he confused a GPS with a compass. This was Middie Rivers, 74 years old, and he knew Glastonbury Mountain better than you know your own Netflix queue. Actually, let's back up and talk about that name for a second. Middie, short for Midicus, a name that sounds like it was pulled from a Latin textbook, but was actually quite common among Vermont families in the late 1800s. Midicus Rivers was born in 1871, which means he had been walking these mountains since before the Glastonbury logging town had even reached its peak. He had watched the town rise and fall. He had seen the forest cut down and grow back. He had witnessed the slow transformation of the mountain from a place of human industry back to pure, untamed wilderness. This was a man who had spent literally his entire life in these woods, not hiking them on weekends, not visiting them for vacation, living in them, working in them, breathing them every single day for more than 7 decades. When other kids his age were learning to read, Middie was learning to track deer through snow so deep it would bury a grown man. When his contemporaries were memorizing multiplication tables, Middie was memorizing which plants would keep you alive and which ones would kill you faster than a bullet. By 1945, Middie Rivers was something of a local legend. He was the guy you called when someone got lost in the woods and needed finding. He was the hunter who could track a wounded deer across 3 counties and bring it down with a single shot. He was the guide who could take city folks up the mountain and bring them back down again with stories they'd tell for the rest of their lives. People trusted Middie Rivers with their lives because he had never given them a reason not to. In a region where hunting accidents were as common as autumn leaves, Middie had never lost a client. In terrain that claimed experienced woodsmen on a regular basis, Middie moved like he was walking through his own backyard. Because in a way, he was. He knew every trail, every stream, every ridge, every valley on Glastonbury Mountain. More than that, he knew the mountain's moods. He could tell you when a storm was coming hours before the first clouds appeared. He could guide you away from areas where the ground was unstable, where old mine shafts waited like hidden graves, where the terrain would shift from solid footing to ankle-breaking treachery without warning. Middie understood the mountain in a way that went beyond mere knowledge. It was intuition born from decades of daily interaction with a landscape that could kill you if you made a single mistake. He could sense when something was wrong, when the normal rhythm of the forest was off, when it was time to pack up and head for lower ground. Which makes what happened on November 12th, 1945, all the more impossible to explain. November 12th, 1945, a crisp autumn day, the kind that makes you understand why people write poetry about New England. The leaves had mostly fallen by then, creating a carpet of gold and brown that rustled underfoot like nature's own percussion section. The air was clean and sharp, with just enough bite to let you know winter was on its way, but not enough to make the hunting unpleasant. Middie was leading a hunting party, 4 men from Massachusetts, who had hired him to guide them through the backcountry in search of deer. These weren't complete novices. They were experienced hunters who had simply recognized that hiring a local guide was the difference between a successful trip and wandering around the woods hoping to get lucky. The group had been out since early morning, following a network of game trails that Middie knew like the lines on his own palm. They were working their way through an area near what locals called the Long Trail Road, a rough track that served as one of the few reliable ways to navigate the mountain's complex geography. It was mid-afternoon when Middie spotted fresh deer sign tracks that indicated a good-sized buck had passed through the area recently. He called the group together and explained his plan. He would scout ahead about 50 yards following the trail to see if he could spot the deer and determine the best approach for a shot. The hunters should wait where they were and watch for his signal. This was standard operating procedure for Middie. He had done this same thing hundreds of times before. Scout ahead, assess the situation, come back, and position the hunters for the best possible shot. It was methodical, safe, and effective. The 4 hunters watched as Middie disappeared around a bend in the trail, his familiar silhouette vanishing into the dappled shadows of the forest. They settled in to wait, whispering among themselves about the size of the tracks they had seen and the quality of the hunting so far. And they waited, and waited, and the silence that followed started to feel heavy, unnatural. You're in the group now. Picture yourself standing there, rifle in hand, surrounded by the quiet sounds of a forest in late autumn, the rustle of dry leaves, the distant call of a crow, the whisper of wind through bare branches. Normal sounds, comforting sounds. But as the minutes tick by, those normal sounds start to feel wrong, because underneath them, there's something else. Something that isn't quite silence, but isn't quite sound either. An absence where there should be presence. Middie Rivers was not a quiet man in the woods. He moved carefully, yes, but he moved with purpose and confidence. You could hear him coming from 100 yards away if you knew what to listen for. The subtle snap of a twig under his boot, the soft scrape of his jacket against a branch, the barely audible rhythm of his breathing. But now there was nothing. No sound of movement ahead, no signal indicating he had spotted the deer, no call to let them know he was changing position or heading back, just silence. The 4 hunters looked at each other, that particular look that passes between men when they realize something is wrong, but don't want to be the first one to say it out loud. How long had it been? 10 minutes, 15. Time has a way of stretching when you're waiting for something that should have happened already. Finally, one of them called out, "Middie, everything okay up there?" The forest swallowed his voice and gave back only echoes, but echoes that sounded somehow wrong, as if they were bouncing off surfaces that shouldn't have been there. They called again, louder this time. Then they started moving, following the trail where Middie had disappeared, expecting at any moment to see his familiar figure emerge from behind a tree with that slight smile he got when he was about to show them something interesting. But the trail was empty. Not just empty of Middie, but empty in a way that felt complete and final. No tracks in the soft earth beyond the ones they had all made earlier. No broken branches or disturbed leaves to indicate that anyone had passed this way recently. It was as if Middie Rivers had simply stepped around that bend in the trail and stepped out of existence. What followed was the most extensive search operation that part of Vermont had ever seen. Word spread quickly through the close-knit communities of the region. Middie Rivers was missing. Middie Rivers who didn't get lost. Middie Rivers who had never failed to bring a hunting party home safe. Volunteers came from 3 counties: state police, forest wardens, local hunters, hikers, anyone who knew the woods and could walk a search line. They had bloodhounds from the state prison tracking dogs with noses so sensitive they could follow a week-old trail through a rainstorm. They searched for days. They combed through every square inch of forest within a 5-mile radius of where Middie had last been seen. They checked every cave, every ravine, every hidden valley where a man might have fallen or sought shelter. They even brought in aircraft, small planes that buzzed low over the canopy looking for any sign of movement or disturbance in the forest below. The bloodhounds were the most puzzling part of the whole operation. These dogs had been used in dozens of search and rescue operations across New England. They had found lost hikers, escaped prisoners, murder victims buried in shallow graves. They were professionals at what they did. But on Glastonbury Mountain, the dogs acted like they had forgotten how to be dogs. They would pick up Middie's scent at the point where he had left the hunting party, follow it for maybe 30 or 40 yards, and then stop. Not lose the scent gradually, the way tracking dogs do when a trail goes cold. Just stop. Completely. As if the scent had hit an invisible wall and couldn't go any further. The handlers tried everything. Fresh clothing from Middie's house to reinforce the scent. Different dogs with different specialties. Starting from different points along the trail. Nothing worked. Every dog had the same reaction. They would track confidently for a short distance, and then just quit sitting down and refusing to go any further, no matter how much their handlers encouraged them. It was the handlers who finally pointed out something that sent chills down the spines of the search coordinators. The dogs weren't acting confused or frustrated the way they normally did when they lost a trail. They were acting afraid. After a week of intensive searching, the volunteer teams were ready to give up. They had covered every inch of accessible terrain multiple times. They had checked and rechecked every possible hiding place, every potential accident site, every location where a 74-year-old man might have sought shelter or fallen victim to misfortune. That's when they found it. The only piece of physical evidence that would ever be discovered. A single unfired rifle cartridge in a small stream about a quarter-mile from where Middie had last been seen. For anyone else, this might not have been significant. Hunters drop ammunition all the time. Cartridges fall out of pockets, bounce out of rifles when you're climbing over fallen logs. Get lost in the general chaos of moving through rough terrain. But this was Middie Rivers we're talking about. Middie Rivers, who treated his ammunition like a surgeon treats his scalpels. This was a man who could tell you exactly how many rounds he was carrying at any given moment. A man who had never in 7 decades of hunting lost a cartridge without knowing exactly where and when it had happened. For Middie Rivers, dropping a rifle cartridge was like a Michelin star chef dropping a perfectly good steak on the floor. It just didn't happen. The cartridge was unfired, still bright and clean, sitting in the shallow water of the stream, like it had been deliberately placed there. There were no signs of a struggle near the water, no footprints in the soft mud of the stream bank, no broken branches or disturbed vegetation to suggest that Middie had been in the area at all. It was as if the cartridge had simply materialized there, a single clue in a mystery that had no other clues at all. Here's what we know for certain about the disappearance of Middie Rivers. A 74-year-old man who knew every inch of Glastonbury Mountain walked around a bend in a familiar trail and vanished completely. No tracks, no signs of a struggle, no evidence of an animal attack, no indication that he had fallen, or become injured, or sought shelter somewhere that the searchers missed. The area where he disappeared was thoroughly searched by experienced woodsmen using professional tracking dogs. The terrain was difficult, but not impossible. The weather was clear and mild. There was no reason for Middie to become disoriented or lost. Yet he was gone, completely and utterly gone, as if he had simply ceased to exist at the moment he stepped around that bend in the trail. The investigators eventually classified it as a missing person case, but their reports make for uncomfortable reading. Words like inexplicable and unprecedented appear frequently. One state police detective wrote that in 20 years of law enforcement, he had never encountered a disappearance that left so few traces. The local newspaper coverage was subdued, almost apologetic, as if the reporters couldn't quite believe they were writing about the vanishing of a man who was practically a local institution. The headline in the Bennington Banner simply read, "Veteran Guide Missing on Glastonbury Mountain." But between the lines, you could sense the bewilderment and growing unease of a community trying to make sense of something that made no sense at all. Middie Rivers became the first modern victim of whatever force or phenomenon had been claiming lives on Glastonbury Mountain for generations. But he wouldn't be the last. In fact, his disappearance was just the opening act in a 5-year drama that would cement the mountain's reputation as one of the most haunted places in America. The mountain had tasted blood, and it was still hungry. Paula Jean Welden was 18 years old, which means she was exactly the right age to believe that the world was full of possibilities, and that most of those possibilities were good ones. She wasn't a brooding loner or a troubled kid acting out against authority. She was a bright, slightly restless sophomore at one of the most progressive colleges in America, the kind of young woman who was trying to figure out who she was going to be in a world that was rapidly changing around her. Picture 1946 for a moment. The war was over. American boys were coming home from Europe and the Pacific with stories that made the rest of the world seem both larger and smaller at the same time. Women who had built bombers and run factories were being told to go back to being housewives, but not all of them were listening. The old rules were being questioned, the old boundaries were being tested, and young people like Paula were right in the middle of it all. Bennington College was the perfect place for someone like Paula to ask those questions. Founded in 1932, it was designed to be different from the start. No grades, no traditional curriculum, no rules about what you could or couldn't study. Students were encouraged to explore, to experiment, to find their own path through the landscape of knowledge and self-discovery. Paula was studying art, but she was also interested in literature psychology and philosophy. She was the kind of student who would spend hours in the library reading books that weren't assigned for any class just because they were interesting. She wrote letters to her family that were full of big ideas and small observations, the kind of correspondence that revealed a mind that was always working, always processing, always looking for connections between things that seemed unrelated. Her friends described her as curious, energetic, and independent. She wasn't particularly outdoorsy, but she wasn't afraid of nature either. She enjoyed taking long walks as a way to clear her head and think through whatever problem or project she was working on. She had hiked some of the local trails around Bennington, always staying on well-marked paths and always letting someone know where she was going. She was, in other words, exactly the kind of young woman who might decide on a whim to take a hike on a Sunday afternoon in December just to get some fresh air and some time alone with her thoughts. She was also exactly the kind of victim that makes a missing person case national news. December 1st, 1946. A Sunday afternoon that started like any other Sunday afternoon in the life of a college sophomore. Paula woke up late as college students do on weekends. She had breakfast with her roommate Elizabeth Johnson in the dining hall of their dormitory. They talked about the usual things: classes, professors, boys' weekend plans, the approaching finals week that was making everyone a little nervous. After breakfast, Paula went back to their room in Dewey House and spent some time reading and writing letters. Sunday afternoons were for catching up on correspondence, and Paula was a faithful letter writer. She had family in Connecticut who liked to hear about her college adventures, and she had friends from high school who were scattered across New England at various colleges and universities. Around noon, Paula told Elizabeth that she was going to the library to work on a paper. This wasn't unusual. Paula often spent Sunday afternoons in the library, which was quiet and conducive to the kind of deep thinking that her coursework required. Elizabeth was planning to spend the afternoon writing letters of her own, so they agreed to meet back at the room for dinner. But Paula didn't go to the library. Instead, she went back to their room and changed into hiking clothes. Sturdy shoes, wool socks, a sweater, and over it all a bright red jacket that she had gotten for her birthday the previous month. It was a beautiful jacket, well made and warm, the kind of deep crimson that would stand out like a beacon against the muted browns and grays of a late autumn forest. She left the dormitory around 2:30 in the afternoon, telling the student monitor at the front desk that she was going for a walk and would be back for dinner. She didn't say where she was planning to walk, and the monitor didn't ask. It was 1946. College students were expected to be responsible for themselves, and a Sunday afternoon hike was hardly the kind of activity that required detailed documentation. Paula walked into downtown Bennington, a pleasant stroll of about a mile from the college campus. She was seen by several people who knew her, waving and calling out greetings as she made her way through the familiar streets of the small Vermont town. She stopped at a local restaurant and asked for directions to the Long Trail, the famous hiking path that runs the length of Vermont from the Massachusetts border to Canada. The Long Trail, the same network of paths where Middie rivers had vanished just over a year earlier. The waitress at the restaurant, who knew Paula by sight if not by name, gave her basic directions to the trailhead. It wasn't far from town, maybe a 20-minute walk to the point where the trail crossed Route 9. The waitress later told investigators that Paula seemed cheerful and relaxed, not like someone who was planning anything drastic or dangerous, just a college girl looking for a nice afternoon hike. From the restaurant, Paula walked to the edge of town, and then began the gentle climb toward the mountains. She was seen by a local couple, Danny and Herb Brown, who were driving home from visiting relatives. They spotted her walking along Route 9, that bright red jacket making her easy to see even from a distance. They noted the time, approximately 3:45 p.m. About 15 minutes later, Paula reached the point where the Long Trail crossed the road. Here she was seen by another couple, Louis and Mary Knapp, who were also driving home from a Sunday afternoon visit. They noticed her because of the jacket, that splash of brilliant color against the drab December landscape, and because she was alone, which was somewhat unusual for a young woman hiking in the mountains. The Knapps watched as Paula turned onto the trail and began walking north toward Glastonbury Mountain. They were the last people to see her alive. Picture Paula Welden at that moment, stepping from the familiar world of asphalt and automobiles onto the ancient pathway of the Long Trail. The transition would have been immediate and dramatic. One moment the sounds of civilization car engines, human voices, the general buzz of a small town on a Sunday afternoon. The next moment, the cathedral silence of the forest in late autumn. The Long Trail in this section runs through what hikers call a green tunnel, a corridor of trees that creates its own microclimate and its own sense of enclosure. Even in December, with most of the leaves fallen, the forest maintains a sense of intimacy, of being wrapped in something larger and older than human civilization. Paula would have felt the temperature drop as soon as she entered the tree line. Forests are natural air conditioners, maintaining temperatures several degrees cooler than the surrounding open areas. The quality of light would have changed too, from the sharp clarity of winter sunlight to the soft, filtered illumination that makes everything in the forest look slightly dreamlike. The trail itself was well maintained and clearly marked. This wasn't some obscure deer path or unmarked logging road. The Long Trail was and still is one of the premier hiking routes in New England, maintained by volunteers and clearly marked with white blazes painted on trees every few hundred yards. It would have been virtually impossible for an alert hiker to lose the trail even in fading daylight. Paula was walking north toward some of the most remote and challenging terrain in Vermont, but she didn't have to go far into that terrain to find herself in serious wilderness. Within half a mile of the road, the Long Trail passes through areas where cell phone service is non-existent even today, where the nearest house might be miles away, where a twisted ankle or a sudden change in weather could turn a pleasant afternoon hike into a life-threatening emergency. But Paula Welden was an experienced enough hiker to know these risks. She had told people she would be back for dinner, which meant she was planning a relatively short hike, probably just a few miles up the trail and back. She was dressed appropriately for the weather and the terrain. She was following a well-marked trail that thousands of people had hiked safely over the years. Everything about her preparations suggested a routine afternoon hike, the kind of thing that college students do all the time without giving it much thought. There was no reason to expect that this particular hike would be any different from dozens of others she had taken in the area, except that this was Glastonbury Mountain, and Glastonbury Mountain had its own ideas about routine. Here's where the story of Paula Welden's disappearance takes a turn from tragic to infuriating, because what happened next was a masterclass in how not to conduct a missing person investigation. When Paula didn't return to Dewey House for dinner, her roommate Elizabeth wasn't immediately concerned. College students miss dinner all the time, especially on Sunday evenings when the dining hall food is less than inspiring, and the local restaurants offer more appealing alternatives. Elizabeth assumed that Paula had decided to grab dinner in town and would be back later in the evening. But when Paula hadn't returned by 10 p.m., Elizabeth began to worry. She checked with other students in the dormitory to see if anyone had seen Paula or knew of her plans for the evening. No one had seen her since she left that afternoon, and no one knew where she had gone beyond Elizabeth's vague recollection that Paula had mentioned going for a walk. Elizabeth reported Paula missing to the house supervisor around 11 p.m. The house supervisor, following standard college protocol, waited until morning to contact the local authorities. This was 1946. Remember when college students were expected to be responsible for themselves, and when a student staying out all night wasn't necessarily cause for immediate panic. It wasn't until Monday morning, nearly 18 hours after Paula had last been seen, that Bennington College officially reported her missing to the local police. Even then, the initial response was lackluster. The Bennington Police Department was a small-town force with limited experience in major investigations. They treated Paula's disappearance as a routine missing person case, the kind that usually resolves itself when the missing person shows up with a good explanation and an apologetic smile. They made some basic inquiries around town, asking if anyone had seen Paula on Sunday evening or Monday morning. They contacted her family in Connecticut to see if she had gone home unexpectedly. They checked with local hospitals to see if she had been treated for any injuries, but they didn't organize a search of the hiking trails. They didn't contact the state police for assistance. They didn't bring in tracking dogs or experienced woodsmen. They essentially assumed that Paula Welden would turn up on her own the way missing college students usually do. It wasn't until Tuesday, more than 48 hours after Paula had disappeared, that anyone thought to search the long trail. By then it was probably already too late. When the search for Paula Welden finally began in earnest, it quickly became clear that this wasn't going to be a routine missing person case. The combination of a pretty college girl, a prestigious school, and a mysterious disappearance proved irresistible to the news media of the 1940s. Reporters descended on Bennington like locusts, turning the quiet college town into a media circus. Photographers stalked the campus looking for dramatic shots of worried students and concerned faculty. Radio reporters broadcast live updates from the search areas, their voices crackling with excitement over the airwaves of New England. The story had everything that newspaper editors loved: youth beauty mystery, and just enough danger to titillate readers without actually threatening them. Paula Welden became a national news story, her photograph appearing on front pages from Boston to Los Angeles. The media attention brought volunteers, hundreds of them pouring into the area to join the search, but it also brought chaos. The mountains around Bennington were suddenly crawling with amateur searchers who had no experience in wilderness rescue, no coordination with the official search teams, and no clear idea of what they were looking for or where to look for it. The official search effort was being coordinated by the Vermont State Police, who had finally been called in when it became clear that the local authorities were in over their heads. But even the state police were struggling to manage the scale of the operation and the intense media scrutiny that came with it. The FBI joined the investigation on Wednesday, December 4th, 3 days after Paula had disappeared. Their involvement was partly due to the possibility that Paula had been kidnapped and taken across state lines, but mostly it was a response to the political pressure that was building as the story gained national attention. The search area was expanded to cover hundreds of square miles of Vermont wilderness. Aircraft were brought in to conduct aerial searches. Bloodhounds were imported from other states. Local hunters and guides were recruited to help navigate the difficult terrain, but for all the manpower and resources that were thrown at the search, the results were frustratingly meager. The bloodhounds lost Paula's scent at almost exactly the same spot where they had lost Middie River's scent the year before. The aerial searches revealed nothing but endless forest. The ground teams found no traces of Paula's passage beyond the confirmed sightings on Route 9. As the days turned into weeks, the investigators began to accumulate a collection of potential clues and witness sightings that seemed promising at first, but ultimately led nowhere. There was the report from a waitress at a local diner who claimed to have served coffee to a young woman, matching Paula's description on the evening of December 1st. The woman had seemed confused and disoriented, asking strange questions about where she was and how to get home. But when investigators followed up on this lead, they found inconsistencies in the waitress's story and no corroborating evidence. There was the sighting of a red jacket in the woods, reported by a hunter who was sure he had seen Paula's distinctive coat hanging from a tree branch deep in the forest. A search team hiked miles through difficult terrain to investigate, only to discover that the red jacket was actually a red survey flag left by forestry workers. There was the report of a suspicious man who had been seen lurking around the college campus in the days before Paula's disappearance. Students and faculty were questioned extensively about this mysterious figure, and composite sketches were drawn and distributed, but no one could agree on what the man looked like or whether he had actually existed at all. Most intriguingly, there was the account of a local man who claimed to have seen Paula on the evening of December 1st, not in the wilderness, but in the company of a well-dressed older man in what appeared to be an expensive automobile. This witness said he had seen them together at a gas station in a neighboring town, and that Paula had seemed distressed but not physically harmed. This lead generated enormous excitement among the investigators and the media. It suggested the possibility of abduction, which would have explained both Paula's disappearance and the lack of any trace of her in the wilderness areas that had been so thoroughly searched. FBI agents spent weeks tracking down this lead, interviewing the witness multiple times, investigating the ownership of expensive automobiles in the region, and following up on every possible connection to Paula's disappearance. But like all the other leads in the case, this one eventually evaporated under scrutiny. The witness's story became less consistent with each telling, and no physical evidence could be found to support his claims. As the official search wound down and the media attention began to fade, the case of Paula Welden's disappearance settled into the realm of unsolved mysteries and amateur speculation. Everyone had a theory, and most of those theories said more about the people proposing them than they did about what had actually happened to Paula. The college administration, desperate to protect Bennington's reputation, favored theories that took Paula away from the campus and the surrounding wilderness. They suggested that she might have run away to start a new life somewhere else, possibly with a secret boyfriend that her friends and family didn't know about. They pointed to her interest in literature and psychology as evidence that she was the kind of deep, complex young woman who might be capable of staging her own disappearance. The local police, embarrassed by their slow response and the criticism they had received in the media, preferred theories that involved outside agitators. They suggested that Paula had been abducted by strangers, possibly drifters or criminals who had been passing through the area. This theory had the advantage of absolving the local authorities of any responsibility for what had happened. The FBI, with their more sophisticated investigative techniques and their access to national databases, explored the possibility that Paula's disappearance was connected to other missing person cases across the country. They looked for patterns, connections, anything that might suggest a serial killer or organized criminal activity. But none of these theories could explain the most basic facts of the case. Paula Welden had been seen walking into the forest on a well-marked trail in broad daylight. She had vanished completely, leaving no trace of her passage beyond the point where multiple witnesses had seen her. Despite one of the most extensive search operations in Vermont history, no evidence of her fate had ever been discovered. The truth was simpler and more disturbing than any of the elaborate theories. Paula Welden had walked into the same wilderness that had claimed Middie Rivers the year before, and she had simply disappeared. Not because of criminals or secret boyfriends or elaborate schemes, but because something about that particular patch of forest seemed to have an appetite for human beings. Paula Welden's disappearance changed everything about how people in Vermont thought about their mountains and forests. What had been a local phenomenon whispered about in small communities, but not taken seriously by outsiders, suddenly became a national story. The case established patterns that would become tragically familiar over the next few years. The bright clothing that made the victim easy to spot from a distance, but seemed to provide no protection against whatever force was claiming them. The well-marked trails that should have made getting lost virtually impossible. The complete absence of physical evidence despite extensive searches by experienced professionals. Most importantly, Paula's case established Glastonbury Mountain as a place of mystery and danger in the public imagination. The mountain was no longer just a remote wilderness area where the occasional hunter or hiker might run into trouble. It was becoming something else, a place where the normal rules of cause and effect seemed to break down, where people could simply vanish as if they had never existed at all. For the families and friends of the victims, Paula's disappearance was a source of enduring anguish. Unlike cases where bodies are found and causes of death are determined, the complete mystery surrounding Paula's fate meant that closure was impossible. Was she dead? Was she alive somewhere, unable or unwilling to return? Had she been murdered, or had she met some other fate that the human mind couldn't quite grasp? These questions would haunt the people who loved Paula Welden for the rest of their lives. But they would also haunt the mountain itself, adding another layer to the growing legend of Glastonbury as a place where people went in but didn't come out. The mountain was developing a taste for disappearances, and it was getting better at them with each victim. Paula Welden was the second course in what would become a 5-year feast of inexplicable vanishings, and the mountain was still hungry. This is the one that breaks your brain. This is the disappearance that makes you question whether we really understand how reality works. Because what happened to James E. Tedford doesn't just defy explanation, it defies physics. Picture a crowded bus. 14 passengers plus a driver, all of them awake, all of them paying attention to their surroundings, the way people do when they're traveling together in a confined space. Picture a vehicle that makes no unscheduled stops, follows a predetermined route and arrives at its destination exactly on time. Now picture one of those passengers simply ceasing to exist somewhere between point A and point B, vanishing so completely that even his fellow travelers don't realize he's gone until the bus reaches its final destination. That's what happened to James Tedford on December 1st, 1949, exactly 3 years to the day after Paula Welden had walked into the Vermont wilderness and disappeared forever. But James Tedford didn't disappear into the wilderness. He disappeared from a moving bus in front of 14 witnesses in a way that should have been absolutely impossible. James E. Tedford was 68 years old in 1949, an age when most men were settling into retirement and spending their days in comfortable routines. But James wasn't most men. He was a veteran of a war that had ended so long ago that most people had forgotten it had ever been fought, and he was still dealing with the aftermath of that conflict more than 30 years later. James had served in World War I back when it was just called the Great War, because nobody imagined that humans would be stupid enough to have another one on that scale. He had been a young man when he shipped off to France in 1917, full of patriotic fervor and romantic notions about glory and honor on the battlefield. What he found instead was mud and poison gas, and the kind of mechanized slaughter that the human mind wasn't designed to process. He came home in 1919 with what they called shell shock. In those days, before they understood enough about trauma to give it more accurate names like post-traumatic stress disorder. The intervening decades had not been kind to James Tedford. He had struggled to hold jobs, struggled with alcohol, struggled with the gap between the hero's welcome that veterans were supposed to receive and the reality of a society that didn't know what to do with men who had seen too much and could never quite forget it. By 1949, James was living at the Bennington Soldiers' Home, a state-run facility that provided housing and care for veterans who had nowhere else to go. It wasn't a bad place as institutional care went in that era, but it wasn't home either. It was a way station for men who had given their youth to their country and had been given very little in return. James had been visiting relatives in northern Vermont over the Thanksgiving holiday, one of the few times each year when he left the predictable routine of the soldiers' home for the unpredictable warmth of family connections. It had been a good visit according to the relatives he stayed with. He had seemed relaxed and happy, more like the man he had been before the war than the damaged veteran he had become afterward. On the afternoon of December 1st, James boarded a bus in St. Albans for the trip back to Bennington. It was a route he had taken many times before, a comfortable journey through familiar Vermont countryside that would deliver him back to the soldiers' home in time for dinner. The bus was full that day, carrying the usual mix of travelers who relied on public transportation in rural Vermont. Workers heading home from jobs in distant towns, families returning from holiday visits, elderly people who didn't drive or couldn't afford automobiles. James took a seat near the middle of the bus, settling in for the 2-hour journey with the patient resignation of a man who had learned to find small comforts in routine. He was seen by multiple passengers during the early part of the trip. He made conversation with the woman sitting across the aisle from him, sharing stories about his visit with his relatives and asking polite questions about her own travels. He was friendly, but not intrusive, the kind of pleasant companion that makes a long bus ride more bearable. About halfway through the journey, James fell asleep. This wasn't unusual. The warm enclosed environment of the bus and the gentle rocking motion of travel often had a soporific effect on passengers, especially older ones who were tired from holiday visits. Several passengers later told investigators that they had noticed James dozing in his seat, his head leaning against the window, his breathing deep and regular. The bus continued its journey through the Vermont countryside, making its scheduled stops in small towns where a few passengers got off and a few others got on. But the core group of travelers, including James Tedford, remained in their seats for the duration of the trip. At least, that's what everyone thought. When the bus pulled into the Bennington terminal at 5:45 p.m. exactly on schedule, the driver began his usual routine of announcing the final stop and helping passengers gather their belongings. The 14 passengers began the familiar ritual of collecting coats and bags, stretching cramped muscles, and preparing to disembark. That's when someone noticed that James Tedford's seat was empty. Not empty in the way that a seat becomes empty when its occupant gets up and walks away. Empty in a way that suggested it had been empty for some time. The seat wasn't warm from recent occupation. There was no depression in the cushion where a body had been sitting. It was as if no one had been sitting there at all. But James's luggage was still in the overhead rack above his seat, exactly where he had placed it when he boarded the bus. His bus schedule was still lying open on the seat, creased and worn from frequent use, as if he had been reading it just moments before. His return ticket, which he would have needed to show the driver, was still in his coat pocket. The other passengers looked around in confusion. Where was the elderly man who had been sitting there just a few minutes ago? Had he gotten off at one of the stops? But no one remembered him leaving the bus. No one remembered the driver calling out his name or helping him with his luggage. No one remembered him saying goodbye or moving toward the front of the bus. The driver was equally bewildered. He was certain that James had been on the bus when they left St. Albans. He had checked his passenger manifest and counted heads as he did at every stop. He was equally certain that the bus had made no unscheduled stops and that no passengers had gotten off between St. Albans and Bennington. Yet James Tedford was gone, vanished, evaporated, as if he had simply ceased to exist somewhere between mile marker 23 and mile marker 24 on a route that the driver had traveled hundreds of times before without incident. Let's think about this logically for a moment, because logic is all we have when confronted with something that defies every law of physics and common sense that we understand. A bus in 1949 was not a complicated vehicle. It had one door located at the front near the driver. That door was operated by the driver and only opened when the bus was stopped at designated stations. There were windows, but they were small and high off the ground, designed to provide ventilation and light, not to serve as emergency exits. For James Tedford to have left the bus voluntarily, he would have had to walk past 14 other passengers, and the driver, all of whom were in a confined space where every movement was visible to multiple people. He would have had to do this without anyone noticing, without anyone asking where he was going, without anyone commenting on his departure. More importantly, he would have had to leave his luggage behind, something that no experienced traveler would do voluntarily. The luggage contained his personal belongings, his medications, and the small mementos from his visit with family. These weren't the kind of possessions that a man of limited means would abandon casually. For James to have left the bus involuntarily, that is to have been forced off by someone else, would have required an even more elaborate scenario. Someone would have had to overpower a grown man in a crowded bus without any of the other passengers noticing a struggle. They would have had to remove him through a door that was controlled by the driver again, without anyone seeing or hearing anything unusual. Both scenarios strain credibility to the breaking point. But the alternative, that James Tedford had somehow vanished from a moving vehicle, without opening a door or window, without disturbing his luggage, without leaving any trace of his departure, strains credibility even further. Yet that's exactly what the evidence suggested had happened. The initial response to James Tedford's disappearance was swift and professional, a marked contrast to the confusion that had characterized the early stages of the Paula Welden investigation 3 years earlier. The Vermont State Police had learned some hard lessons from that case, and they were determined not to repeat their mistakes. Within hours of the bus arriving in Bennington, investigators were interviewing every passenger who had been on board. They wanted detailed accounts of where each person had been sitting, what they had observed during the journey, and when they had last seen James Tedford. The stories were remarkably consistent. All 14 passengers remembered James boarding the bus in St. Albans. Most of them remembered his friendly conversation during the early part of the trip. Several specifically recalled seeing him fall asleep in his seat about halfway through the journey. But no one, not a single passenger out of 14, remembered seeing him leave the bus. No one remembered him getting up from his seat, walking to the front of the bus, or exiting at any of the scheduled stops. As far as they were concerned, he had simply been there one moment and gone the next. The driver's account was equally puzzling. He was certain that James had been on the bus when they left St. Albans, because he had checked his passenger count as part of his standard procedure. He was equally certain that the bus had made no unscheduled stops, and that he had not opened the door for any passengers to exit between St. Albans and Bennington. Yet somehow James Tedford was no longer on the bus. Investigators examined the vehicle itself, looking for any signs of tampering or any way that a passenger might have exited without using the front door. They found nothing. The windows were intact and showed no signs of having been opened recently. The emergency exits, such as they were in 1949, had not been disturbed. The door mechanisms were functioning normally and showed no evidence of unauthorized operation. They retraced the bus route, stopping at every station where the vehicle had made scheduled stops to ask if anyone had seen James Tedford. They interviewed station agents, other travelers, local residents who might have noticed an elderly man getting off a bus unexpectedly. No one had seen anything. They searched the areas around each bus stop, thinking that perhaps James had suffered some kind of medical emergency and had wandered away from the station in a confused state. They found no trace of him. As the investigation continued, it became clear that James Tedford's disappearance was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern that was emerging around Glastonbury Mountain and the surrounding area. The investigators were well aware of the Middie Rivers case from 1945 and the Paula Welden case from 1946. They had files on both disappearances, and they couldn't help but notice the similarities experienced responsible people who had vanished completely in areas that should have been safe and familiar. But James Tedford's case was different in important ways. Unlike Middie and Paula, James had not disappeared from a remote wilderness area where accidents and misadventures were at least theoretically possible. He had disappeared from a vehicle in the presence of multiple witnesses under circumstances that defied rational explanation. This was not a case of someone getting lost in the woods, or falling into a hidden crevice, or being attacked by a wild animal. This was something else, entirely, something that challenged the basic assumptions about how the physical world operated. The date was significant too. December 1st, 1949 was exactly 3 years after Paula Welden had vanished on the long trail. The timing felt like more than a coincidence, as if whatever force was responsible for these disappearances was operating on some kind of schedule. Investigators began to expand their inquiry beyond the immediate circumstances of James's disappearance. They looked into his background, his mental state, his relationships with family and friends. They explored the possibility that he had staged his own disappearance for reasons that weren't immediately apparent. But everything they learned about James Tedford contradicted the idea that he was capable of orchestrating something so elaborate. He was a simple man with simple needs, living on a veteran's pension and the charity of the state. He had no secret fortune to protect no enemies, to escape no compelling reason, to abandon the only stable living situation he had known in years. The investigation eventually expanded to include federal authorities who were concerned about the possibility that James had been the victim of some kind of organized crime. The FBI looked into connections between his disappearance and other missing person cases across the country, searching for patterns that might suggest kidnapping or human trafficking. But like all the other theories that were proposed to explain James Tedford's disappearance, the federal investigation ultimately led nowhere. There were no connections to other cases, no evidence of criminal activity, no logical explanation for how a man could vanish from a moving bus in front of 14 witnesses. James Tedford's disappearance remains even today one of the most baffling missing person cases in American history. It combines the impossible logistics of his vanishing with the eerie timing of its occurrence, creating a mystery that seems designed to resist solution. Unlike the other disappearances associated with Glastonbury Mountain, James's case can't be explained away by reference to the dangers of wilderness hiking or the unpredictability of mountain weather. This was something that happened in a controlled environment, witnessed by multiple people, under circumstances that should have made disappearance impossible. The case file, when it was finally closed years later, contained hundreds of pages of witness statements, investigation reports, and theoretical explanations. But none of it added up to a coherent answer to the central question: how does a man vanish from a moving bus without anyone noticing until it's too late? Perhaps that's the wrong question. Perhaps the right question is, what kind of force or phenomenon could make such a thing possible? And what does it say about the nature of reality that such things can happen at all? James Tedford became the third victim of whatever was claiming lives in and around Glastonbury Mountain. But unlike Middie Rivers and Paula Welden, who had at least had the misfortune to disappear in remote wilderness areas, James had been taken from what should have been the safety of human civilization. The mountain, it seemed, was expanding its reach, and it was getting bolder about when and where it chose to feed. This one's the heartbreaker. This is the case that transforms the Bennington Triangle from a collection of mysterious disappearances into something that feels personal, immediate, and utterly devastating. Because when the victim is an 8-year-old child, all the theoretical discussions about unexplained phenomena and supernatural forces suddenly become very real and very cruel. Paul Jepson was 8 years old in October of 1950, which means he was at that perfect age where the world was still full of wonder and adventure, but he was old enough to be trusted with small responsibilities. He was the kind of kid who could spend hours entertaining himself with nothing more than a stick, and his imagination who found magic in ordinary things like puddles and pile of leaves and the way sunlight filtered through tree branches. His family lived and worked on a farm in the small community of Rexford, Vermont, just a few miles from the base of Glastonbury Mountain. It wasn't their farm. Paul's father worked for the owner, helping to maintain the property and care for the livestock. It was honest work that provided a modest living and a place to live, the kind of arrangement that was common in rural Vermont in the 1950s. The farm specialized in pigs, which meant that Paul had grown up around these intelligent, sometimes unpredictable animals. He knew how to behave around them, how to move through the barnyard without startling them, how to stay out of the way when the adults were working. It was his world, as familiar and safe as any 8-year-old's bedroom. October 12th, 1950 was a beautiful autumn day, the kind that makes you understand why people write songs about New England in the fall. The leaves were at their peak, creating a landscape that looked like it had been painted by an artist with an unlimited supply of gold and crimson paint. The air was crisp, but not cold perfect for outdoor work and children's play. Paul's mother was working that day driving one of the farm's trucks to transport feed and supplies around the property. It was a job that required her to make multiple trips between different locations, loading and unloading cargo, checking on animals in various pastures. Paul often accompanied her on these rounds, riding along in the passenger seat and helping in small ways that made him feel important and useful. But on this particular day, Paul was more interested in playing than in helping with farm work. When his mother pulled up to the area near the pig pens to unload a shipment of feed, Paul asked if he could stay and play while she finished her work. It was a reasonable request from a responsible child, and the location was safe and familiar. The pig pen was enclosed. The area was visible from multiple directions, and Paul had played there many times before without incident. His mother agreed, with the usual motherly warnings about staying where she could see him and not getting too close to the pigs. She would be working for just a few minutes, she told him, unloading the truck and arranging the feed. He should stay right where he was and not wander off. Paul promised, as 8-year-olds do, to stay put and be good. He watched his mother begin her work, then turned his attention to the more interesting business of finding things to explore and investigate in the familiar but always changing landscape of the farmyard. That was the last time anyone saw Paul Jepson alive. Just like Paula Welden, 4 years earlier, Paul was wearing a bright red jacket on the day he disappeared. This detail feels too specific to be a coincidence, too pointed to be mere chance. A splash of brilliant color against the muted autumn landscape, visible from hundreds of yards away, unmistakable and unforgettable. The jacket was new, a recent purchase for the coming winter. Paul's mother had bought it for him just a few weeks earlier, choosing the bright red color, partly because it was cheerful and partly because it would make him easy to spot when he was playing outdoors. In rural Vermont, where hunting season brought armed strangers into the woods, and visibility could mean the difference between safety and tragedy, bright clothing wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a survival strategy. Paul loved that jacket. He wore it every day, proud of its newness and the way it made him feel grown up and important. On the morning of October 12th, he had put it on without being asked, zipping it up carefully and smoothing down the sleeves the way his mother had taught him. When his mother looked back at him after unloading the first batch of feed from the truck, Paul was exactly where she had left him, a small figure in a bright red jacket, playing contentedly near the pig pen. The pigs were moving around in their enclosure, snuffling and grunting in the way that pigs do, and Paul was watching them with the fascinated attention that children bring to animal behavior. The scene was so normal, so perfectly ordinary, that it would be burned into his mother's memory for the rest of her life. Her son safe and happy playing in a familiar place on a beautiful day, wearing a jacket that made him visible from half a mile away. She turned back to her work, lifting another bag of feed from the truck bed. The job would take maybe 5 more minutes, she estimated, just enough time to get everything unloaded and properly stored before Paul got bored and started asking when they could move on to the next stop. But when she looked back again, Paul was gone, not hiding behind a tree or wandering around the corner of a building. Gone. Completely and utterly vanished, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. Paul's mother later said that she knew something was wrong immediately with the kind of maternal instinct that defies logical explanation. This wasn't a child who had wandered off to explore something interesting. This wasn't a boy who had gotten distracted and forgotten where he was supposed to be. This was something else, something that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up and sent ice water through her veins. She called his name loudly and urgently, her voice carrying across the farmyard and echoing off the buildings. No response. She ran to the pig pen, thinking that perhaps he had climbed inside the enclosure and was hidden from view by the animals or the feeding equipment. The pigs looked up at her with their intelligent eyes, but there was no sign of Paul. She ran around the entire perimeter of the immediate area, calling his name, continuously checking. Behind every building and under every piece of farm equipment, where an 8-year-old might hide or take shelter, nothing. Other workers on the farm heard her calling and came running to help. Within minutes, a dozen adults were searching the immediate area, their voices joining hers in calling Paul's name. They checked the barn, the other animal pens, the equipment sheds, the farmhouse. They looked in every place where a small boy might go to explore or hide or play. The search expanded quickly to include the surrounding fields and the edge of the forest that bordered the farm property. Someone thought to check the well, that traditional source of rural nightmares, but it was properly covered and showed no signs of disturbance. Others searched the pond where the animals came to drink, looking for any sign that Paul might have fallen in. But there was nothing. No tracks, no disturbed vegetation, no piece of clothing caught on a fence or a tree branch. No indication that Paul had left the immediate area under his own power or had been taken by someone else. It was as if he had simply evaporated, leaving behind only the memory of a small boy in a red jacket playing contentedly near a pig pen on a beautiful autumn afternoon. The Vermont State Police arrived within hours of Paul's disappearance being reported, bringing with them the same professional tracking dogs that had been used in the searches for Middie Rivers, Paula Welden, and James Tedford. These were experienced bloodhounds with handlers who had participated in dozens of search and rescue operations across New England. The dogs were given articles of Paul's clothing to establish his scent, then released to begin their tracking. They immediately picked up his trail from the area near the pig pen, confirming that Paul had indeed been playing there when his mother last saw him. But then something strange happened. The dogs followed Paul's scent trail away from the farm, through a pasture, across a small stream, and towards the edge of the forest. This part made sense. It suggested that Paul had wandered away from the farm, perhaps following something interesting that had caught his attention. The trail led to a dirt road that connected the farm to the main highway, a route that Paul would have known because his family traveled it regularly. The dogs followed the scent along the road for about half a mile, their handlers growing increasingly optimistic that they were closing in on some clue about Paul's fate. And then the trail simply stopped. Not at a house or a building where Paul might have taken shelter, not at a vehicle or a location where he might have been picked up by someone. The trail stopped at a crossroads, a simple intersection where the dirt road met another country lane. The handlers tried everything they could think of. They cast the dogs in wider and wider circles around the crossroads, hoping to pick up the scent again on one of the intersecting roads. They brought in fresh dogs with different specialties. They had Paul's mother bring more clothing from home to strengthen the scent trail. Nothing worked. Every dog had the same reaction. They would follow Paul's trail confidently to the crossroads, then stop completely, sitting down and refusing to go any further, despite the urgent encouragement of their handlers. It was one of the handlers who pointed out the eerie significance of the location. The crossroads where Paul's scent trail ended was the same intersection where Paula Welden had been seen 4 years earlier during her own ill-fated hike into the wilderness around Glastonbury Mountain. 2 victims, 4 years apart, both last traced to the exact same spot on a country road that seemed to have no particular significance beyond its function as a meeting place for 2 dirt lanes in the middle of rural Vermont. The failure of the bloodhounds to track Paul beyond the crossroads prompted the largest search operation in Vermont history up to that point. Hundreds of volunteers joined professional search teams in combing through thousands of acres of forest farmland and mountain terrain. The search was coordinated by state police, but included local law enforcement forest wardens, members of the National Guard, and civilian volunteers from across New England. Aircraft were brought in to conduct aerial searches of areas too remote or difficult for ground teams to reach effectively. The search teams were methodical and thorough, working in grid patterns to ensure that no area was overlooked. They searched abandoned buildings, old mine shafts, caves, ravines, streams, ponds, any location where a small boy might have wandered or where someone might have hidden evidence of a crime. They found nothing. No clothing, no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no sign that Paul Jepson had ever been in any of the areas they searched. Despite covering hundreds of square miles over the course of 2 weeks, the professional searchers were no more successful than the bloodhounds had been. The failure of such an extensive search operation raised disturbing questions about what had happened to Paul. If he had simply gotten lost in the woods, his body would have been found eventually. Children don't disappear without a trace, especially not in areas that are being searched by experienced professionals using systematic methods. If he had been abducted, there should have been evidence, tire tracks, witness sightings, some indication of a vehicle or person in the area who didn't belong. But investigators found no such evidence despite interviewing dozens of local residents and checking the backgrounds of everyone who had been in the area on the day Paul disappeared. The search operation gradually wound down as it became clear that traditional methods were not going to solve the mystery of Paul Jepson's disappearance. But the impact of the case continued to reverberate through the communities around Glastonbury Mountain. By the fall of 1950, it was becoming impossible to ignore the pattern that was emerging around Glastonbury Mountain. 4 people in 5 years, all vanishing under circumstances that defied explanation, all leaving behind mysteries that professional investigators could not solve. Paul Jepson's case was particularly disturbing because of his age and the circumstances of his disappearance. Unlike the previous victims, Paul had vanished from a location where he should have been constantly visible to multiple adults. His disappearance couldn't be attributed to the risks of wilderness hiking or the complexities of adult decision-making. This was a child who had been playing in his own backyard, essentially under the watchful eye of his mother. If Paul Jepson could disappear under those circumstances, then no one was safe. No location was secure. No amount of caution or preparation could guarantee protection against whatever force was claiming victims around Glastonbury Mountain. The case also highlighted the inadequacy of conventional investigative methods when confronted with truly inexplicable phenomena. The bloodhounds, the search teams, the systematic grid searches, all of the tools that normally worked in missing person cases had failed completely. It was as if Paul Jepson had stepped through some kind of invisible doorway at that crossroads, moving from the ordinary world of farms and families into a realm where the normal rules of cause and effect no longer applied. Local folklore enthusiasts and amateur investigators began to pay attention to details that the professional searchers had overlooked or dismissed. The crossroads where Paul's trail ended, they pointed out, had significance beyond its connection to Paula Welden's disappearance. In traditional folklore, crossroads are places of power, locations where the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds becomes thin and permeable. They are places where deals are made with otherworldly forces, where travelers must choose between different paths that lead to very different destinies. The fact that 2 victims of the Bennington Triangle had been connected to the same crossroads felt like more than coincidence to those who were inclined to see supernatural explanations for the disappearances. It suggested that certain locations around Glastonbury Mountain might serve as focal points for whatever force was responsible for the vanishings. The red clothing worn by both Paula Welden and Paul Jepson also attracted attention from folklore enthusiasts. In many traditional belief systems, the color red has significance as a marker or beacon, something that attracts the attention of supernatural entities. Whether these folklore connections had any basis in reality was impossible to determine, but they provided a framework for understanding the disappearances that was more satisfying than the complete absence of explanation offered by conventional investigation. For the families of the victims, folklore explanations were simultaneously comforting and terrifying. comforting because they suggested that the disappearances were part of some larger pattern or purpose rather than random acts of violence or cruelty. Terrifying because they implied that the victims had been claimed by forces that were beyond human understanding or control. Paul Jepson became the fourth victim of the Bennington Triangle, a small boy in a red jacket who had stepped from the safety of ordinary life into a mystery that would never be solved. His disappearance marked the beginning of the most intensive phase of the phenomenon, a period when the mountain's hunger seemed to accelerate and its methods became even more brazen and inexplicable. There would be one more victim before the mysterious force that claimed lives around Glastonbury Mountain finally seemed to satisfy its appetite. But that final disappearance would be different from all the others, offering tantalizing clues about the fate of the missing, while raising even more disturbing questions about the nature of the phenomenon itself. And just when you think you have a pattern, when you start to understand the rules of whatever game is being played on Glastonbury Mountain, the universe throws you a curveball that makes everything else look simple by comparison. Frida Langer is the final and strangest piece of the Bennington Triangle puzzle, because she's the only one they ever found. But being found, as it turns out, doesn't necessarily mean being found alive. And it doesn't necessarily provide answers. In fact, in Frida's case, being found only added new layers of mystery to a story that was already impossible to explain. Frida Langer was 53 years old in the autumn of 1950, a woman at the age when most people were settling into the comfortable routines of middle age. She was married, lived in North Adams, Massachusetts, and was known among her friends and family as someone who enjoyed the outdoors, but approached it with the caution and preparation that comes with experience. Frida wasn't a casual hiker. She was someone who took the wilderness seriously, who understood that the mountains of New England could be beautiful and deadly in equal measure. She dressed appropriately for the weather and terrain, carried emergency supplies, and never hiked alone without telling someone exactly where she was going and when she expected to return. She was also someone who knew the area around Glastonbury Mountain well. She had been hiking and camping in the region for years, long before it became associated with mysterious disappearances and supernatural phenomena. To Frida, the mountains were a source of peace and renewal, a place where she could escape from the pressures of everyday life and reconnect with the natural world. Which makes what happened to her on October 28, 1950, just 16 days after Paul Jepson had vanished from a farm at the base of the mountain, all the more disturbing. The last weekend of October 1950 was perfect for camping in Vermont. The autumn foliage was past its peak, but still spectacular. The weather was crisp, but not cold, and the hunting season hadn't yet brought crowds of armed strangers into the wilderness. It was exactly the kind of conditions that experienced outdoors enthusiasts looked for when planning camping trips. Frida had organized a family camping expedition to Somerset Reservoir, a remote body of water nestled in the mountains about 10 miles from the town of Bennington. The reservoir was a popular destination for fishing and camping, accessible by a rough road that discouraged casual visitors, but was manageable for people with the right equipment and experience. The camping party included Frida, her cousin Herbert Elsner, and several other family members who shared Frida's love of the outdoors. They had made this same trip multiple times before, always enjoying the combination of beautiful scenery, good fishing, and the kind of peaceful isolation that was becoming harder to find in post-war America. They set up camp on Friday afternoon, October 27th, establishing their tents and cooking area in a clearing near the water's edge. The evening was spent around a campfire, sharing stories and enjoying the kind of simple pleasures that make camping memorable: good food cooked over an open fire, the sound of water lapping against the shore, vast canopy of stars that's visible only in places far from electric lights. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold, perfect for hiking. After breakfast, Frida and Herbert decided to take a walk along one of the trails that led away from the reservoir and up into the surrounding mountains. It was a trail they had hiked before, well marked and not particularly challenging, the kind of morning constitutional that experienced campers often took to work off the previous night's campfire cooking. They set out around 10 a.m., planning to hike for a few hours and return to camp in time for lunch. The trail they chose led through mixed forest, gradually gaining elevation as it wound its way up the slopes of the mountains that surrounded Somerset Reservoir. For the first mile or so, the hike proceeded exactly as planned. Frida and Herbert walked at a comfortable pace, stopping occasionally to admire the views or to identify birds and plants that caught their attention. The morning air was crisp and clean, filled with the scents of pine and fallen leaves that make autumn hiking so appealing. Then Frida slipped. About a mile and a half from their campsite, the trail crossed a small stream via a series of rocks that served as natural stepping stones. It was the kind of minor obstacle that experienced hikers navigate thousands of times without incident, requiring nothing more than basic balance and common sense. But on this particular morning, one of the rocks was slicker than it appeared. As Frida stepped from one stone to another, her foot slipped and she fell sideways into the stream. It wasn't a dramatic fall or a particularly dangerous one. The water was only knee-deep, and the stream bed was rocky, but not treacherous. However, it was enough to thoroughly soak Frida's clothing and boots. In October in Vermont, even a brief immersion in cold mountain water can quickly lead to hypothermia, if not addressed immediately. Frida knew this, and she made the sensible decision that any experienced outdoors person would make in similar circumstances. She told Herbert that she was going to hike back to their campsite to change into dry clothes. It was a straightforward plan. She would retrace their route along the well-marked trail change clothes at the camp, and then either rejoin Herbert on the trail or wait for him to return from his continued hike. Herbert offered to accompany her back to camp, but Frida declined. She was perfectly capable of hiking the mile and a half back to the reservoir on her own, and there was no reason for both of them to cut short their morning hike because of her clumsiness. She would be fine, she assured him. She would see him back at camp in an hour or two. Herbert watched as Frida started back down the trail, her wet clothes steaming slightly in the cool mountain air. She looked uncomfortable but not distressed, moving at a steady pace that suggested she was eager to get back to camp and into dry clothing. That was the last time anyone saw Frida Langer alive. Herbert continued his hike for another hour, reaching a scenic overlook that offered panoramic views of the surrounding mountains and valleys. He spent some time enjoying the scenery and taking photographs, then began his own return journey to the campsite. When he arrived back at the reservoir around 1 p.m., he expected to find Frida there, probably wearing dry clothes and perhaps preparing lunch. But the campsite was exactly as they had left it. Frida's wet clothes were not hanging up to dry. There was no sign that she had returned to change clothes as planned. Herbert wasn't immediately alarmed. Frida might have decided to take a longer route back to camp, or she might have stopped to rest somewhere along the trail. She was an experienced hiker who knew how to take care of herself in the wilderness. But as the afternoon wore on and Frida didn't appear, Herbert's concern began to grow. By 4 p.m., he decided to hike back along the trail to look for her. Perhaps she had twisted an ankle or encountered some other minor problem that was delaying her return. He retraced the entire route they had taken that morning, calling Frida's name and looking for any sign that she had passed this way. He found the stream where she had fallen still showing wet marks on the rocks where her boots had slipped. But beyond that point, there was no trace of her passage. Herbert searched until dark, then returned to the campsite, hoping that Frida had somehow made her way back by a different route. But the camp was still empty, and Frida's gear was still packed exactly as she had left it. By Sunday morning, when Frida had been missing for more than 24 hours, Herbert knew that something was seriously wrong. He packed up the camp and drove to Bennington to report Frida's disappearance to the authorities. The response to Frida Langer's disappearance was immediate and overwhelming, reflecting both the lessons learned from previous cases and the growing awareness that something genuinely unusual was happening around Glastonbury Mountain. Within hours of Herbert's report, search teams were mobilizing for what would become the largest search and rescue operation in Vermont history. The Vermont State Police coordinated the effort, but participants included local law enforcement forest wardens, members of the National Guard Civil Air Patrol pilots, and hundreds of civilian volunteers. The search area was vast, covering thousands of acres of mountainous terrain around Somerset Reservoir. But unlike the previous cases this time, the searchers had a clear starting point and a definite timeline. They knew exactly where Frida had been last seen and approximately when she had disappeared. The initial focus was on the trail between the stream crossing and the campsite, the route that Frida should have taken on her return journey. Search teams combed through every inch of this corridor, looking for any sign that Frida had passed this way or had left the trail for any reason. They found nothing. No footprints in the soft earth beside the trail. No broken branches or disturbed vegetation to suggest that someone had pushed through the underbrush. No piece of clothing caught on a tree or bush. It was as if Frida had simply vanished somewhere between the stream and the campsite. The search expanded to include the entire area around Somerset Reservoir, then the surrounding mountains and valleys. Aircraft were brought in to conduct aerial searches of areas too remote for ground teams to reach effectively. Bloodhounds were imported from other states to track Frida's scent, but like the dogs used in previous searches around Glastonbury Mountain, the bloodhounds behaved strangely. They could track Frida's scent from the campsite to the stream where she had fallen, but beyond that point they seemed unable to pick up any trail at all. The search continued for 2 weeks, involving more than 1,000 participants and covering an area of over 300 square miles. It was a massive coordinated effort that represented the best of search and rescue capabilities in 1950, and it found absolutely nothing. As winter settled over the Green Mountains, the official search for Frida Langer was reluctantly called off. The searchers had done everything humanly possible, covering vast areas with systematic thoroughness and using every available resource and technique. The failure to find any trace of Frida was particularly frustrating, because the search conditions had been ideal. The weather had been clear during the critical period after her disappearance. The terrain, while challenging, was not impenetrable. The search area had been clearly defined and systematically covered. Yet somehow Frida Langer had vanished as completely as the previous victims of the Bennington Triangle. Despite knowing exactly where and when she had disappeared, despite having the largest search operation in Vermont history looking for her, she had simply evaporated from the physical world. The winter months brought occasional reports of possible sightings or clues, but none of them led anywhere. Hunters claimed to have seen signs of human passage in remote areas, but investigation always revealed that the signs were either misidentified animal tracks or evidence of other legitimate wilderness users. As spring approached and the snow began to melt, there was renewed hope that Frida's body might be discovered by hikers or by the melting process itself. Bodies that are hidden by snow sometimes become visible as winter gives way to spring, and searchers prepared to resume their efforts as soon as weather conditions permitted. But spring came and went without any discoveries. Summer arrived with its crop of tourists and hikers, all of whom were made aware of the missing woman, and asked to report any unusual findings. Nothing was reported. By the time autumn returned to Vermont, Frida Langer had been missing for almost a year. Her family had reluctantly begun to accept that she was probably dead and that her body might never be found. The case was still officially open, but active investigation had essentially ceased. And then on May 12, 1951, 7 months after the search had been called off, Frida Langer was found. The discovery was made by a local fisherman who was exploring a remote area near Somerset Reservoir in preparation for the opening of trout season. He was walking through an open field, an area that had been searched multiple times during the previous autumn, when he spotted what appeared to be human remains. The location was shocking for several reasons. First, it was in an open field with excellent visibility, the kind of area where a body should have been spotted immediately by aerial searches. Second, it was an area that had been covered multiple times by ground search teams using systematic grid patterns. Third, it was less than 2 miles from where Frida had last been seen, well within the core search area that had received the most intensive attention. The remains were definitely those of Frida Langer, identified through dental records and personal effects that were found with the body. But the condition of the remains and their location raised more questions than they answered. First, there was the issue of preservation. After 7 months in the Vermont wilderness, including a full winter of snow, ice, and spring thawing, the remains should have been in a state of advanced decomposition. Instead, they were remarkably well preserved, as if they had been protected from the elements by some unknown means. Second, there was the location itself. The open field where Frida was found had been searched repeatedly by experienced teams using both visual observation and trained search dogs. It was inconceivable that human remains could have been lying in such an exposed location for 7 months without being discovered. Third, there was the positioning of the body. Frida's remains were lying in the open, not hidden under brush or snow, not concealed in any way. They were simply lying in the middle of the field as if they had been placed there recently. The official cause of death was listed as undetermined due to exposure and decomposition. But this determination was largely meaningless given the questions surrounding the discovery. How had Frida died? When had she died? And most importantly, where had her body been for the 7 months between her disappearance and its discovery? The discovery of Frida Langer's body was supposed to provide closure to the Bennington Triangle mystery, but instead it only deepened the puzzle. For the first time, investigators had physical evidence related to one of the disappearances, but that evidence raised more questions than it answered. The medical examination of Frida's remains provided few clues about her fate. The cause of death could not be determined with certainty, though exposure and hypothermia were considered the most likely explanations. But this didn't explain how she had ended up in a location that had been thoroughly searched, or why her body had not been discovered for 7 months. Investigators explored several theories to explain the circumstances of the discovery. Perhaps Frida's body had been covered by snow or debris and had only recently been exposed by natural processes, but the field where she was found had been searched during the winter months when there was no snow cover, and the positioning of the remains suggested they had not been covered or concealed. Perhaps the body had been moved by animals either after death or during the intervening months, but there was no evidence of animal disturbance, and the remains were essentially intact and positioned in a way that suggested human rather than animal agency. Perhaps Frida had somehow survived for a period after her disappearance and had died in the field where she was found. But this theory required explaining how she had survived for months in the wilderness without being detected by the massive search operation, and how she had ended up in a location that had been repeatedly searched. None of the conventional explanations made sense given the physical evidence and the documented history of the search operation. The discovery of Frida Langer's body was as inexplicable as her original disappearance. Frida Langer's case represents the culmination of the Bennington Triangle phenomenon, the final piece in a puzzle that defies conventional understanding. Unlike the previous victims, Frida was eventually found, but her discovery only confirmed that something genuinely unusual had been happening around Glastonbury Mountain. The pattern was now complete. 5 people had disappeared in the space of 5 years, all in the same general area, all under circumstances that defied explanation. 4 of them had vanished completely, leaving no trace despite extensive searches. The 5th had been found in a location where she couldn't possibly have been for the entire period of her disappearance. What made Frida's case particularly significant was that it provided physical evidence of the phenomenon while simultaneously proving that conventional investigation methods were inadequate to explain it. Here was a body that had been missing for 7 months, found in a location that had been searched repeatedly by experienced professionals. The implications were disturbing. If Frida's body could be missing from an open field for 7 months and then suddenly appear there as if it had always been present, what did that say about the nature of the force or phenomenon responsible for the disappearances? More importantly, what did it say about the fate of the other victims? Were Middie Rivers, Paula Welden, James Tedford, and Paul Jepson simply missing, or were they existing in some state or location that was beyond the reach of conventional search methods? Frida Langer's disappearance in October 1950 marked the end of the active phase of the Bennington Triangle phenomenon. After her case, the mysterious disappearances around Glastonbury Mountain essentially ceased. There would be occasional missing person cases in the region over the following decades, but none with the inexplicable characteristics that had defined the 5 cases between 1945 and 1950. Why the phenomenon ended as abruptly as it had begun remains another unanswered question. Perhaps whatever force was responsible for the disappearances had satisfied its appetite. Perhaps the increased attention and investigation had somehow disrupted its operations. Or perhaps the 5-year period represented a natural cycle that had simply run its course. The discovery of Frida's body in 1951 provided a form of closure to the Bennington Triangle mystery, but it was closure without resolution. Questions remained about what had happened to her during the 7 months she was missing, just as questions remained about the fate of the other 4 victims. What was clear was that something extraordinary had occurred in the mountains of Vermont during the late 1940s and early 1950s. 5 people had encountered a force or phenomenon that was beyond the understanding of conventional science and investigation. One of them had been returned after a fashion, but the others remained lost in whatever realm or dimension had claimed them. The Bennington Triangle had established itself as one of America's most enduring unsolved mysteries, a place where the boundary between the natural and supernatural seemed to break down completely. And in the mountains of Vermont, the legend of Glastonbury Mountain grew ever darker and more compelling, a testament to the enduring power of the unknown to capture human imagination and challenge human understanding. Okay, let's start with Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually the correct one, right? So let's examine the possibility that the Bennington Triangle is just what happens when you combine dangerous terrain, unpredictable weather, and a hefty dose of human error and bad luck. The mountains of Vermont are genuinely treacherous places, even for experienced outdoors enthusiasts. We're talking about terrain that was carved by glaciers riddled with hidden caves and crevices dotted with abandoned mine shafts that aren't marked on any modern map. The weather can shift from pleasant to life-threatening in the space of an hour. Get caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the wilderness will kill you with an efficiency that would impress a Swiss watchmaker. Consider the geology of Glastonbury Mountain specifically. The underlying bedrock is shot through with quartz veins and limestone formations that create natural caves and underground chambers. Some of these caverns are large enough to swallow a person whole, deep enough that a body might never be recovered, hidden well enough that even experienced searchers could walk right over them without knowing they exist. Add to this the legacy of 19th century mining operations. The mountains around Glastonbury are honeycombed with old shafts and tunnels, most of them completely unmarked, many of them partially collapsed or flooded. A hiker who stepped on the wrong piece of seemingly solid ground could find themselves falling into a void that was dug by miners who died before their grandparents were born. Then there's the weather factor. The Green Mountains create their own microclimate, with conditions that can change dramatically over very short distances. You might start a hike in pleasant autumn sunshine and find yourself in freezing fog 20 minutes later. Hypothermia can set in faster than most people realize, and once your core body temperature starts dropping, your decision-making ability goes with it. People who are succumbing to hypothermia often exhibit what's called paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon where they remove their clothes even though they're freezing to death. They also tend to seek out small, enclosed spaces in a behavior that experts call terminal burrowing. Someone in the final stages of hypothermia might crawl into a cave or crevice where their body would never be found, even by searchers who pass within a few feet of their location. Wildlife could also play a role. Black bears are common in Vermont, and while attacks on humans are rare, they do occur. A bear could easily overpower any of the Bennington Triangle victims, and bears are notorious for dragging their kills to remote locations where human searchers would never think to look. But here's the problem with the mundane explanations: they don't account for the specific details that make these cases so baffling. Middie Rivers was too experienced to fall into a mine shaft or get lost in familiar terrain. Paula Welden was following a well-marked trail in good weather. James Tedford disappeared from a moving bus, which pretty much rules out bears and hypothermia. Paul Jepson vanished from his own backyard, essentially. Each individual case might have a rational explanation, but taken together, they form a pattern that resists conventional analysis. 5 people, 5 years, all in the same general area, all under circumstances that should have made disappearance difficult, if not impossible. The mundane explanations work better for some cases than others, but none of them work for all 5 cases. And that's where things start to get interesting. This is the explanation that gets the most traction with people who want to believe that there's always a rational human explanation for inexplicable events. The idea is simple. Someone was hunting people around Glastonbury Mountain, someone smart enough and careful enough to kill without leaving evidence, someone who operated for 5 years before either dying, moving away, or simply stopping. It's not an implausible theory on its face. Serial killers do exist, and some of them are extremely sophisticated in their methods. Ted Bundy managed to kill dozens of people across multiple states while maintaining the facade of a charming normal college student. The Green River Killer operated for decades before being caught. There's precedent for killers who can evade detection for years while continuing to claim victims. The geographic clustering of the disappearances certainly fits the serial killer model. Most serial killers operate within a specific comfort zone, an area they know well enough to hunt effectively and dispose of evidence safely. The 5-year time frame also fits. Serial killers often have active periods followed by dormant phases, sometimes ending their careers abruptly due to death imprisonment for other crimes or psychological factors. The victim selection, however, is problematic for this theory. Serial killers typically have a preferred victim type based on age, gender, physical appearance, or behavioral patterns. But the Bennington Triangle victims were remarkably diverse: a 74-year-old mountain guide, an 18-year-old college student, a 68-year-old veteran, an 8-year-old boy, and a 53-year-old outdoors woman. That's not the kind of consistency you typically see in serial killer cases. More damaging to the serial killer theory is the complete absence of physical evidence. Even the most careful killers usually leave some trace of their activities: tire tracks, witness sightings, DNA evidence, something that connects them to their victims or their crime scenes. But despite extensive investigation by state and federal authorities, no such evidence was ever found in any of the Bennington Triangle cases. The logistics are also problematic. How does a serial killer snatch a man off a moving bus without anyone noticing? How do you kidnap an 8-year-old from a farmyard where he's being watched by multiple adults? How do you overpower an experienced woodsman like Middie Rivers in terrain he knows better than anyone alive? And then there's the James Tedford case, which pretty much destroys the serial killer theory entirely. Unless you're willing to believe that our hypothetical killer had the ability to teleport or turn invisible, there's simply no way that a human perpetrator could have removed Tedford from that bus without being seen by 14 other passengers. The serial killer theory is popular because it preserves our sense that the world operates according to rational, understandable rules. But it requires us to ignore too many inconvenient facts about the specific circumstances of these disappearances. A killer who is so meticulous he leaves 0 evidence 5 times across 5 years and manages to snatch a man off a moving bus. That's not a serial killer, that's a James Bond villain. Before we dive into the more exotic theories, we need to talk about the man who essentially created the modern legend of the Bennington Triangle. Joseph A. Citro is a Vermont author and folklorist who has spent decades collecting and documenting stories of unusual phenomena throughout New England. He's the guy who connected the dots between the 5 disappearances and gave this weirdness a brand name that stuck. Citro didn't discover the disappearances. They were already well documented in police files and newspaper archives. But he was the first person to recognize the pattern and present it as a unified phenomenon rather than a series of unrelated incidents. His book, Green Mountain's Dark Tales, brought the Bennington Triangle to national attention and established it as one of America's premier unsolved mysteries. What Citro did was essentially create a framework for understanding these events that went beyond the failed attempts at rational explanation. He placed the disappearances in the context of Vermont folklore and regional history, showing how they fit into a larger pattern of unusual phenomena that had been reported in the area for generations. This is important because it shifted the conversation from how do we solve these individual cases to what does this pattern tell us about the nature of this place? Citro wasn't necessarily arguing for supernatural explanations, but he was suggesting that some locations might be inherently prone to unusual events for reasons that we don't fully understand. The Bennington Triangle, as conceived by Citro, isn't just about 5 disappearances in the 1940s and 1950s. It's about a long history of unusual phenomena in the region. Native American legends about the mountain being cursed, reports of strange lights and sounds, sightings of unusual creatures, and a general sense among locals that certain areas should be avoided. This broader context doesn't explain what happened to Middie Rivers or Paula Welden, but it does suggest that their disappearances might be part of something larger and older than a simple series of criminal acts or accidents, and that's where the theories start to get really interesting. Look, am I saying Bigfoot did it? No. But am I saying that in a place where people vanish from moving buses, a giant hairy ape man suddenly seems like one of the more reasonable options? Maybe. The idea that some kind of unknown creature might be responsible for the disappearances isn't as far-fetched as it might sound at first. Vermont has a long history of Bigfoot sightings going back to Native American legends about giant hairy creatures that lived in the deep woods. Local newspapers from the 19th and early 20th centuries contain dozens of accounts of encounters with large ape-like beings in the mountains around Glastonbury. The creature described in these reports is typically 7 to 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur, and possessed of strength and agility far beyond that of any known animal. Witnesses describe it as intelligent but not necessarily hostile, more like a very large, very reclusive primate that occasionally crosses paths with human beings. Could such a creature be responsible for the Bennington Triangle disappearances? The physical requirements certainly fit. Something that large and strong could easily overpower any of the victims, including Middie Rivers, despite his experience and outdoor skills. The creature's presumed intelligence might explain the lack of physical evidence. A smart predator learns to hunt without leaving traces. The geographic clustering also makes sense if you're dealing with a territorial animal. Most large predators have defined hunting grounds that they patrol regularly. The 5-year active period could represent the lifespan of a single animal, or the time that a particular creature spent in the area before moving on to new territory. But the Bigfoot theory has some serious problems. First, there's the issue of James Tedford's disappearance from the bus. Even the most athletic Sasquatch can't teleport onto a moving vehicle, overpower a passenger, and teleport away again without being seen by 14 other people. Second, there's the complete absence of physical evidence. Large primates leave tracks, hair samples, scat, and other signs of their presence. Despite extensive searches by experienced trackers, no such evidence was found in any of the Bennington Triangle cases. Third, there's the issue of victim disposal. Large predators typically consume their kills or at least leave behind remains that can be found by searchers. The complete disappearance of 4 of the 5 victims suggests something more sophisticated than simple predation. The Bigfoot theory is appealing because it provides a physically plausible explanation for at least some of the disappearances. But like the serial killer theory, it breaks down when you examine the specific details of the cases. Whatever happened to the Bennington Triangle victims, it was probably something weirder than a really big monkey. And now we put on our tinfoil hats. UFO sightings were rampant in the post-war era, partly because people were seeing more aircraft than ever before, and partly because the atomic age had made everyone acutely aware that the universe was much stranger and more dangerous than they had previously imagined. The idea that extraterrestrial visitors might be responsible for the Bennington Triangle disappearances gained traction in the 1960s and 1970s when UFO research was at its peak and people were more willing to consider explanations that went beyond conventional science. The theory goes something like this. Glastonbury Mountain is a hotspot for UFO activity either because of some natural phenomenon that attracts alien attention or because extraterrestrials have established some kind of base or monitoring station in the area. The disappearances represent alien abductions, with the victims being taken for study, experimentation, or other purposes that we can't understand. This theory has some interesting features. It would explain the complete lack of physical evidence, since alien technology would presumably be sophisticated enough to remove victims without leaving traces. It would explain the diverse victim profile, since aliens might be interested in studying a cross-section of human types, rather than focusing on a specific demographic. The timing also fits, since the late 1940s and early 1950s were the beginning of the modern UFO era. The first widely reported flying saucer sighting occurred in 1947, just 2 years after Middie Rivers disappeared and 1 year after Paula Welden vanished. But the UFO theory has the same fundamental problem as all the other theories. It can't account for the specific circumstances of individual cases. How do aliens abduct someone from a moving bus without being seen by other passengers? Why would they take people from such public locations, rather than from isolated areas where abduction would be easier and less risky? A more sophisticated version of the extraterrestrial theory involves the concept of dimensional portals or gateways. The idea is that certain locations on Earth serve as thin spots in the fabric of space-time places, where it's possible to move between our dimension and others. In this version of the theory, Glastonbury Mountain is some kind of interdimensional crossroads, a place where the normal rules of physics break down and travel between parallel universes becomes possible. The disappearances occur when victims accidentally step through these portals, either by chance or because they're somehow drawn to them. The portal theory would explain why the disappearances seem to defy physical laws. If the victims aren't just moving through normal space, but are actually shifting between dimensions, then concepts like locked doors and moving vehicles become irrelevant. It would also explain the discovery of Frida Langer's body 7 months after her disappearance. Perhaps she spent those months in a parallel dimension before somehow finding her way back to our reality, dying in the process due to the strain of interdimensional travel. This sounds like bad science fiction, but when the real-world explanations fail, your imagination starts to run wild. And there's something appealing about the idea that there are still places on Earth where magic is possible, where the mundane world gives way to something larger and more mysterious. Or maybe it's simpler and more disturbing than aliens or monsters or serial killers. Maybe it's the land itself. The idea that the Native Americans were right all along, that some places are just wrong. Not evil necessarily, but indifferent to human life in a way that makes them fundamentally hostile to our continued existence. This is the theory that I find most unsettling, partly because it's the hardest to dismiss, and partly because it suggests that the universe is far stranger and more dangerous than we want to believe. The idea goes like this. Certain locations on Earth possess properties that we don't understand, phenomena that can't be explained by current scientific knowledge, but are nonetheless real and measurable in their effects. These might be geological anomalies, electromagnetic disturbances, gravitational irregularities, or something else entirely. Glastonbury Mountain, according to this theory, is one of these anomalous locations. There's something about the specific combination of geology, geography, and electromagnetic environment that creates conditions where the normal rules of cause and effect break down. People don't disappear because something takes them, but because the laws of physics themselves become unreliable in certain locations under certain circumstances. This would explain why the disappearances seem to follow their own logic rather than conforming to any human or animal pattern. It's not that there's an intelligence behind the vanishings, but rather that the mountain itself represents a kind of naturally occurring anomaly where impossible things become possible. The 5-year active period might represent a natural cycle like earthquake activity or solar flares. The geographic clustering might indicate that the anomalous properties are concentrated in a specific area. The diverse victim profile might simply reflect the fact that the phenomenon affects anyone who happens to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, regardless of age, gender, or experience level. This theory has the advantage of not requiring us to believe in aliens, monsters, or criminal masterminds. It only requires us to accept that our understanding of physics and reality is incomplete, which is almost certainly true regardless of what happened on Glastonbury Mountain. But it's also the most disturbing theory because it suggests that we live in a universe where random locations can suddenly become deadly for reasons we can't predict or control. It implies that there might be other places like Glastonbury Mountain, other spots on the map where the simple act of being present can result in ceasing to exist. To me, that's scarier than any monster. A serial killer can be caught, an animal can be avoided, aliens can presumably be reasoned with. But a fundamental breakdown in the laws of physics, that's the kind of threat that makes you want to stay home and never venture into the wilderness again. There's one more theory that we need to consider, even though it's the least satisfying from a storytelling perspective. The idea that the Bennington Triangle is essentially a creation of human psychology, a pattern that exists more in our minds than in physical reality. According to this theory, the 5 disappearances were indeed unusual, but they were also unrelated incidents that happened to occur in the same general area over a relatively short period of time. The sense that they form a pattern comes from our natural tendency to look for connections and meaning in random events. Humans are incredibly good at finding patterns even when no patterns exist. We see faces in clouds, hear voices in static, and detect conspiracies and coincidences. When 5 people disappear in the same area over 5 years, it's natural to assume that there's some connection between the cases, even if that connection exists only in our perception. The psychological theory suggests that once the idea of the Bennington Triangle was established, it created a feedback loop that reinforced the perception of supernatural activity in the area. Subsequent unusual events were interpreted through the lens of the triangle legend, while perfectly normal events were ignored or forgotten. This is called confirmation bias, and it's one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. Once we believe something, we tend to notice evidence that supports our belief while ignoring evidence that contradicts it. If you believe that Glastonbury Mountain is haunted, you're more likely to interpret strange sounds as supernatural activity and less likely to notice all the times you hike in the area without incident. The media attention surrounding the disappearances would have amplified this effect. Newspaper coverage, books, television shows, and internet discussions all contribute to the legend of the Bennington Triangle, making it seem more significant and mysterious than it actually is. From this perspective, the Bennington Triangle is a cultural creation rather than a physical phenomenon. It exists because we want it to exist, because we need mysteries and unexplained phenomena to make life more interesting than it would be if everything had a rational explanation. This theory explains a lot about why the Bennington Triangle has become such an enduring legend. It doesn't explain what actually happened to Middie Rivers, Paula Welden, James Tedford, Paul Jepson, and Frida Langer. For that, we might need to accept that some mysteries are genuinely unsolvable, at least with our current level of understanding. Perhaps the most honest answer is that we don't know what happened on Glastonbury Mountain during those 5 years in the 1940s and 1950s. Each theory has strengths and weaknesses, each explains some aspects of the cases while failing to account for others. The mundane explanations work for individual cases, but break down when applied to the pattern as a whole. The exotic theories can account for the impossible aspects of the disappearances, but require us to accept concepts that challenge our basic understanding of reality. Maybe the truth is some combination of all these factors. Maybe the mountain is indeed an unusual place prone to strange phenomena for reasons we don't understand, and maybe some of the disappearances have conventional explanations while others don't. Maybe the real mystery isn't what happened to the victims, but why this particular place at this particular time became a focal point for events that seem to transcend ordinary reality. What we do know is that 5 people walked into the wilderness around Glastonbury Mountain and were never seen alive again. 4 of them vanished completely, leaving no trace despite extensive searches. 1 was found under circumstances that raise more questions than they answer. These are not the kinds of disappearances that happen in ordinary places under ordinary circumstances. Whatever force or phenomenon was responsible for the Bennington Triangle, it was something that operated outside the normal boundaries of human experience. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the value of the Bennington Triangle isn't in solving the mystery, but in preserving it, in maintaining a space, in our rational technological world, for things that can't be explained or understood. Maybe we need places like Glastonbury Mountain to remind us that the universe is still full of wonders and terrors that lie beyond the reach of our instruments and theories. The mountain keeps its secrets, and perhaps that's exactly as it should be. So after all this, what are we left with? 5 stories? 5 empty spaces at family dinner tables. A handful of baffling clues and a patch of beautiful, terrifying woods in Vermont. The Bennington Triangle isn't a mystery you solve. It's a story you absorb. It's a modern folk tale written in the ink of real tragedy. We've spent hours together walking through the details of these disappearances, examining the evidence, considering the theories. We've met Middie Rivers, the mountain guide, who knew every inch of Glastonbury Mountain until the mountain decided to know him back. We've followed Paula Welden in her bright red jacket as she walked from the familiar world of college life into something far stranger and more permanent. We've sat on that bus with James Tedford as he vanished from a moving vehicle in front of 14 witnesses. We've watched Paul Jepson play in his farmyard until the very earth seemed to swallow him whole. And we've tracked Frida Langer through her impossible journey from missing person to discovered body, a return that raised more questions than it answered. Each case is impossible in its own way. Taken together, they form a pattern that defies everything we think we know about how the world works. This isn't just about people getting lost in the woods or falling victim to criminal activity. This is about something that operates outside the normal boundaries of cause and effect, something that can reach into our ordinary world and extract people from it as easily as we might pluck flowers from a garden. The theories we've explored range from the mundane to the fantastic, from serial killers to interdimensional portals to hungry mountains that feed on human souls. Each theory explains some aspects of the cases while failing to account for others. The truth, if there is a single truth, remains elusive. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the value of the Bennington Triangle isn't in its solution, but in its persistence as an unsolved mystery. In our age of GPS satellites and DNA analysis, of surveillance cameras and social media tracking, there's something almost comforting about the existence of a mystery that resists all attempts at explanation. It's a chilling reminder, isn't it? In our world of GPS satellite imagery and constant connectivity, there are still places where you can take one wrong step and be wiped off the face of the earth. It makes you appreciate your Wi-Fi and the mundane safety of your own home, doesn't it? The simple, boring luxury of not vanishing. We live in an era where we can track a pizza delivery in real time, where our phones know our location to within a few feet, where missing persons cases are solved using cell phone data and credit card transactions. We've created a world where anonymity is nearly impossible, and true disappearance is supposed to be a relic of earlier, less connected times. But the Bennington Triangle reminds us that our technological safety net has limits. There are still places where GPS signals don't reach, where cell towers can't penetrate, where the old rules of the wilderness still apply. And in those places, people can still vanish as completely as if they had never existed at all. This is uncomfortable for us to contemplate because it challenges our sense of control and security. We want to believe that we've tamed the natural world, that we've made it safe and predictable through the application of science and technology. The idea that there might still be places where the wild things are, where forces beyond our understanding can reach out and touch us, goes against everything we've been taught about progress and civilization. But perhaps that's exactly what makes the Bennington Triangle so compelling. In a world that often feels over-explained and over-documented, it preserves a space for genuine mystery. It reminds us that for all our technological sophistication, we still don't understand everything about the world we live in. The mountains of Vermont aren't particularly remote by global standards. Glastonbury Mountain isn't in the Amazon rainforest or the Siberian wilderness. It's in New England, a few hours' drive from Boston and New York City. If something this strange can happen in such a relatively civilized and well-traveled area, what does that say about the truly wild places that still exist on our planet? The Bennington Triangle has become more than just a collection of unsolved missing persons cases. It's become a cultural phenomenon, a lens through which we examine our relationship with the natural world and our place in a universe that might be far stranger than we're comfortable admitting. The story has influenced writers, filmmakers, paranormal investigators, and amateur sleuths for decades. It's spawned books, documentaries, podcast episodes, and countless internet discussions. The disappearances of 5 people in 1940s Vermont have become part of American folklore, joining the ranks of other enduring mysteries like the Roanoke Colony and D.B. Cooper. But unlike some famous mysteries that have become almost cartoonish through repetition and embellishment, the Bennington Triangle has retained its power to unsettle and disturb. Perhaps this is because the cases are so well documented, the circumstances so specific and verifiable. These aren't vague legends or half-remembered folk tales. These are real people who really disappeared under circumstances that really can't be explained. The families of the victims have had to live with this uncertainty for decades. Paula Welden's parents died without ever knowing what happened to their daughter. Paul Jepson's mother carried the guilt of that momentary inattention for the rest of her life. The relatives of all 5 victims have had to construct their own explanations for losses that defy conventional understanding. For the broader community around Glastonbury Mountain, the Triangle has become both a burden and a source of identity. Local businesses capitalize on the mystery, offering guided tours and selling souvenirs. But longtime residents also speak of the shadow that the disappearances have cast over the region, the way they've changed how people think about their home landscape. What do you guys think? I want to hear your theories, no matter how wild. Which case sticks with you the most? For me, it's always been Tedford on the bus. There's something about the impossibility of that disappearance, the way it violates every law of physics and common sense, that makes it the most unsettling of all the cases. Paula Welden's case has the most human drama, the bright young woman with her whole life ahead of her, walking into the forest and never coming back. Paul Jepson's disappearance is the most heartbreaking, the 8-year-old boy in his red jacket, vanishing from what should have been the safety of his own backyard. Middie Rivers represents the death of expertise, the idea that knowledge and experience can't always protect you from the unknown. Frida Langer's case is perhaps the most disturbing, because her discovery raises the possibility that the other victims might still be out there somewhere, existing in a state or location that we can't comprehend. But it's James Tedford's vanishing from that crowded bus that really challenges everything we think we know about reality. It's the case that makes you wonder whether our understanding of the physical world is as complete as we'd like to believe. Each person who encounters the Bennington Triangle story seems to gravitate toward a different explanation, and I think that says something important about how we process information that doesn't fit our existing frameworks. Some people immediately jump to supernatural explanations because they're more comfortable with the idea of ghosts or aliens than with the possibility that reality itself might be more flexible than we assume. Others cling to rational explanations, even when those explanations require increasingly elaborate scenarios to account for all the facts. The truth is probably somewhere in between, or perhaps it's something we haven't even thought of yet. The universe has a way of being stranger than our strangest theories, and the Bennington Triangle might be evidence of phenomena that won't be understood until science advances in ways we can't currently imagine. Alright, that's our journey into the triangle for tonight. I hope it gave you something fascinating to ponder as you drift off. Thanks for hanging out with me in the dark corners of history. Stay curious, sleep well, and I'll see you in the next deep dive. The Bennington Triangle stands as a testament to the enduring power of mystery in our increasingly demystified world. It reminds us that there are still questions without answers, still places where the impossible becomes possible, still stories that resist all attempts at rational explanation. Maybe that's enough. Maybe the real value of mysteries like this isn't in solving them, but in preserving them and maintaining spaces in our logical, ordered world for things that transcend logic and order. Maybe we need places like Glastonbury Mountain to remind us that the universe is still full of wonders and terrors that lie beyond the reach of our instruments and theories. The mountain keeps its secrets, and perhaps that's exactly as it should be. In a world where everything seems explicable and predictable, the Bennington Triangle preserves a corner of genuine mystery, a place where the old magic still works, and the impossible can still happen. Sweet dreams, everyone. And if you ever find yourself hiking in the mountains of Vermont, maybe stick to the well-traveled trails. Some paths once taken don't lead back home. Got any ideas for where we should go next? Drop them below. The world is full of dark corners and unsolved mysteries, and I'm always looking for the next story that will keep us both awake and fascinated long into the night.